In a lecture entitled The Stable and the Manger, Alvin Boyd Kuhn said, "Bible stories are in no sense a record of what happened to a man or a people as historical occurrence. They mean nothing as outward events, but they mean everything as picturizations of that which is our living experience at all times. The actors are not old kings, priests, and warriors. The one actor in every portrayal, in every scene, is the human soul. The Bible is the drama of our history here and now, and it is not apprehended in its full force and applicability until every reader discerns himself or herself to be the central figure in it." Here, as we reach December solstice and the celebration of Christmas, we can see that the Bible stories, in common with the myths of cultures around the world, are based on the stars and heavenly cycles. And you can see that actually in the timing of the celebration of Christmas. The sun's lowest arc in the sky for the northern hemisphere takes place on the December solstice. That's when the North Pole is pointed most directly away from the sun. In that relationship of the cycle of the Earth-Sun dance, the North Pole of the Earth is most directly pointed away from the sun on the December solstice, and at the same time the South Pole is pointed most directly at the sun, so you get the highest arc of the sun above the horizon in the southern hemisphere. Same time you're getting the lowest arc of the sun in the northern hemisphere. So the sun arc keeps getting lower and lower and lower as we approach the December solstice. And then there's this pause, a 3-day pause. You can look at the azimuth of the sun's rising, and it gets further and further south as we approach the December solstice in the northern hemisphere, and then it pauses for 3 days before it turns back around. And you can observe that in the azimuth tables that are published by various sources. But 3 days after it reaches that lowest point and it pauses there at that solstice, the sun it's like the train waiting at the station. That's what the word means, sun at the station or stationary. It pauses, then it begins to move back northward. So it reaches that lowest point and then it pauses for 3 days, and then it starts to move back northward. That's when it's born. It's like a new birth. It's like the birth of the sun as it starts to move back northward. So when does that happen? Well, we actually have to adjust the calendar a little bit to try and keep it in line with the solstices. That's what leap years are all about. But the December solstice typically happens on the 21st of December, and then it'll start slipping a little bit because of the fact that there's not exactly 365 days in a year. The turning of the earth is not exactly the same as the return of the sun-earth relationship to the solstices. So leap years are thrown in there, but it shifts around a little bit between the 21st and the 22nd, but mostly we try and keep it on the 21st using that leap year system. So if the 21st is the lowest point and then it pauses there for 3 days, when does it turn around and start going back again towards the north? When is it born? 3 days after the 21st is the 24th. So the 24th, Christmas Eve. Well, why don't we celebrate Christmas on the 24th? Well, actually, the celebration begins at midnight on the 24th. That's why you have midnight mass, and that's why there's traditions about going to church for a midnight service on Christmas Eve, because the sun at midnight is at its lowest point underneath our feet. At noon, the sun is directly overhead. At midnight, the sun is on the other side of the sphere of the earth, and the whole earth is between us and the sun. So to get to the sun at midnight, you'd have to drill a hole down under the earth, down through the chambers of the earth, all the way down through all the rock, and the sun would be on the other side of the earth. So that is the lowest point, is midnight on the 24th. That's the end of that 3-day pause. The sun is at its lowest point, and then it is born as it turns around. The celebration takes place beginning at the 24th at midnight. That's when, in some cultures, when they put the manger scene up, the creche, the shepherds around Joseph and Mary and baby Jesus and the angels, they don't actually place the baby in the manger in some cultures until midnight on the 24th, Christmas Eve. In some cultures, the tradition is that the oldest daughter places the baby Jesus in the manger at midnight on the 24th. The whole story is built around this symbology and the cycles of the year. That's why in the Mithraic cult, or the secret society of Mithras, Mithras was said to be born out of a rock. Remember, on the 24th, the sun is down at midnight, down under the rocks of the earth, and then after midnight is when the sun starts to turn back upwards. It's at its lowest point, and then after that it's moving towards sunrise on the 25th, and then we're going to see the sun moving towards the north. So the symbology is different. In the Mithraic mysteries, there's these symbols of Mithras being born out of a rock, and Mithras is not associated with the same constellation as Jesus. David Ulansey, in his landmark book, The Origins of the Mithraic Mysteries, he talks about Mithraism being based on celestial cycles and the stars, and he makes the correct and very convincing case that the figure of Mithras is associated with the constellation Perseus. The figure of Jesus is associated with Ophiuchus, and also sometimes with Aquarius, the sign of the Son of Man that separates the sheep from the goats, but mostly with Ophiuchus, and I can show that, and I talked about that in some of my videos and online courses and books. But these stories are based on the stars. Born in a manger also has to do with the stars of the constellation, the zodiac constellation of Cancer, the crab, which is directly overhead. I've talked about this using the analysis of Robert Taylor from the early 1800s in a video talking about the celestial origins of the visit of the Magi and the birth in the manger story, and you can see that video on YouTube. I did that several years ago, but you can still see that. So these stories are all celestial. They're metaphorical. They're not about a historical personage. They're actually about recovery of self. Literalism, taking these stories literally, ushered in the destruction, the deliberate destruction of the ancient wisdom given in these myths. Literalism ushered in opposition to the ancient wisdom, and it brought about the Dark Ages, the collapse of antiquity, the rise of feudalism and serfdom. It created a situation that obscures the whole message of these stories. And so I'll conclude with another quotation from Alvin Boyd Kuhn, this time from his 1940 masterpiece called Lost Light. He's talking about the lost light of the ancient wisdom. I've changed around the order of the sentences a little bit, but this is from Alvin Boyd Kuhn's Lost Light, where he says the real heresy and apostasy is to miss deity where it is to be had, in the blind effort to seek it where it is not available. The pagan world provided a contact with a God dwelling immediately within the human breast. I'll interject here into his quotation and say, with all the gods. So the gods, the reason why there's a multiplicity of gods is because we have a multiplicity of gods within. That's what I talk about in my most recent book, invoking the ancient gods in you. So Alvin Boyd Kuhn, to return to his quotation, says the ancient wisdom, he calls it the pagan world, but the ancient myths given to all the cultures of the world provided contact with a god, and I would say with gods, dwelling immediately within the human breast. No reaching after the moon of the absolute, in other words, some absolute deity outside and unreachable, diverted conscious purpose from actual touch with the God who stood at one's elbow. You actually have access to deity, but you have to find it in the right place. The kingdom of heaven and the hope of glory are within. They lurk within the unfathomed depths of consciousness. Christianity euhemerized the deity in us. Euhemerized is a verb that comes from a figure named Euhemerus, who said, well, all these myths are based on historical figures. That's euhemerizing. It's basically saying the myths are actually about historical figures. And Kuhn disagrees with that. He says turning the myths into some pretended terrestrial history is to miss the whole story. So he says Christianity did that, took a mythical Christ and tried to turn that story into something that was about a historical figure. And he says when you do that, the personalized Jesus cuts the commonality of mankind off from its divinity. It turns the story into something external and not about something that's going on inside each and every one of us. Like the first quotation says, you don't grasp the story until you realize it's about you. And we can see that it is not historical, that it is about heavenly cycles and celestial metaphors, not about history. And that then begs the question, well, what's the metaphor about? What's it doing there? What's the purpose of this metaphor? The metaphor is to explain, to dramatize something that is in us, to help us understand how to grasp the deity where it is available, dwelling immediately within the human breast, standing right there at your elbow, just waiting for you. Not even at your elbow, but actually within. The kingdom of heaven and the hope of glory are within. And so at this time of year, that is a time to really perceive this, but it is something you can do every day. It is available. Despite all of that historical misdirection, this message is still as powerful today as ever, and we need it more today than ever. Thank you so much. And happy solstice and Christmas in its original esoteric understanding.